Do you ever feel stuck as a producer? Like you're spinning your wheels, uncertain of why you're not moving forward? I certainly have, and after more than a decade of producing music, here's the biggest lesson on improvement that I've had to learn the hard way. Progress is not defined by more gear, more plugins, or even more tutorials. What we need, my friend, is to put in more reps. Let's talk about it. It is January 2025 as I recorded this video, and I know this time of the year has a lot of us feeling motivated and inspired. Many of us are setting goals, making plans, and I think that's great. Personally, I don't hate New Year's resolutions. I know they get a bad rap, but I actually think goals are very, very important. That said, there is something I've noticed not only with newer producers, but also with the students that I mentor and coach that I want to address today in hopes that it sets you on the right course, not only for this year, but for the remainder of your production journey. We are currently in a time where getting into music production has never been easier. Tools are affordable, the resources are everywhere, and there is no shortage of gear, plugins, or tutorials. But here's the problem. With so many options, it's also really easy to fall into what I call the consumption cycle. The consumption cycle is when we continuously buy more gear, download more plugins, or binge tutorials, thinking that that alone will somehow magically bridge the gap between where we are and where we want to be. Now, I want to be clear, I am not saying that tools and education are not important. They are. You need tools to create, like a painter needs their brush, and you need education to learn the craft. But what I'm saying is that those things alone won't make you any better. You can have the best gear in the world and have attended the best music production program, but if you don't actually sit in front of your computer, in front of your DAW and put in the time, then none of that matters. You have to put in the reps. And listen, I get it. I've been on this exact boat, and I know why we do this. Music production, like many things, and especially at first, can be overwhelming. So consuming things like gear, plugins, and tutorials feels good, because they give you the sense of progress, the feeling of progress, without the discomfort of doing the actual work. Watching one more tutorial or buying one more piece of gear feels good because it makes us feel like we're headed in the right direction. But if we don't actually use the gear or put those techniques into practice, then it doesn't really make a difference. Putting in the reps is scary. I get it, because it means that you are taken off the training wheels and potentially having to face the reality that you're not as good as you want to be yet. But from my experience, putting in the reps is the only meaningful way to make progress, because action creates clarity. Now, all of this sounds great in theory, but I like practicality. So let's talk about some tactics and mindset shifts that have helped me over the years that might also help you now put in more reps this year. Okay, so this is a big one, and if you leave this video and forget everything else that I said, I want you to at least remember this. I often hear people say that they only create whenever they get inspired or motivated, and I couldn't disagree more. Inspiration is a powerful tool, and it should not be ignored. But the problem with inspiration or motivation is that it is an entirely reactive approach. Most of the time, we can't control whenever we're going to be inspired. And so if you rely on just that, then you might not end up creating at all. From my experience, creativity is more like a muscle that needs to be exercised. And just like hitting the gym, we have to develop enough discipline to show up as much as we can, even when we don't feel like it. Now, if you're saying, that feels forced, my best music comes out organically, I get it, and you're not wrong. However, let's use that gym example from before to understand why it might still help. I don't know about you, but the hardest part for me about going to the gym and working out is simply getting there. There is so much friction between my couch and the gym doors that working out oftentimes feels like an impossible mountain to climb. However, once I actually get there, I'm like, well, I'm already here. I might as well hop on the treadmill, and little by little, I end up getting some sort of workout. The same concept applies to music. The hardest part is always getting started, but what often tends to happen is that once you get going, our creative juices start flowing. I'm a rapper now. Our creative juices start flowing, and we fall into this thing called flow. And flow, if you don't know, there's a great book on it. I'll make sure to link it somewhere here. But essentially, it's whenever you're so engulfed into a task that you just lose track of time, and it's a really beautiful thing. If you've done music, I'm almost certain you've experienced flow. But so you end up falling into this thing called flow, and most of the time we end up creating something. And here's the best part. Even if that something isn't that great, it was at least a lesson, a guide as to what works and what doesn't. More importantly though, what this is doing is it's putting the power back into our hands. Many people, including myself at one point, believe that results happen a little like this, where motivation creates an action, which then leads to results. However, I have found that the cycle actually really works more like this, where an action creates momentum, which leads to some sort of result, which then creates motivation, and thus repeating the cycle, but in a positive way. Using that gym example again, you can see how this is true here as well. People don't wait to go to the gym until they're ripped. It doesn't work that way. You go to the gym first, struggle a ton in the beginning, but the more you do it, the better you get at it, the more results you start to see, the more confident you become, and the more likely you are to come back. But it all starts with the discipline to get moving in the first place. Now, if you're brand new to this, or if you've been struggling with this for a while, then this might still seem like an impossible task. So here are a few things that I do to make it easier to get going and put in the reps. As mentioned before, one of the biggest challenges to getting started is breaking through that initial momentum. And so I truly believe in making it as easy as possible to get started. And I do this by having a dedicated space with all my stuff ready to go. Now, to clarify, I am not saying that you need an entire room like me. Even if it's just a small corner of a room, having a dedicated space with all your equipment already set up helps a ton to reduce the friction between where you are and where you want to be by removing yet another obstacle. Additionally, from what I've read on a couple of different research studies and books, it also helps prime your brain into associating that space with creativity, which can also help with that initial momentum. If you want to take it a step further, I would also spend some time creating a template that works for you, because I have found that templates just serve as a nice springboard to get you going, so that way you're not always starting from scratch. You don't always have to use them, but again, if you're having trouble starting, or if you just like things a certain way like I do when I produce, then they can be very helpful. You don't have to use mine, but if you do use Studio One, then I'll make sure to link mine down below. Speaking of dedicated spaces, this is another big one. And so if you are a recovering perfectionist like me, then listen up. I am not in the camp of people who will tell you that gear doesn't matter. It does. When you upgrade to better sounds or get better equipment, that can have a positive effect on your production. However, I am in the camp of people who will tell you that you don't need the best to get started. This idea that you need to wait until you get the perfect setup is simply another lie that we tell ourselves in order to avoid doing the work. Work with what you have and upgrade as you go. Okay, so once you have your space set up, the next most important thing that you can do for your growth is set aside some dedicated time for your production. I say this to my mentorship students all the time, but if production is a part of your daily routine, then the more likely you are to stick with it. The important thing here, though, is to be realistic. Don't promise to dedicate 2 hours if you know you don't have that much time. Each of our lives looks a little differently, so if you only have 30 minutes a day, then do just that, but remember to stay consistent. Small, consistent strides are better than lofty goals that never get accomplished. By the way, this also applies to the actual work that you do whenever you sit down. When you sit down to produce, it doesn't always have to be to finish a full song. I used to think this way, and honestly, all it would do is just shoot up my anxiety, and oftentimes I would just end up closing my computer in frustration. When you sit down to create, the task doesn't have to be huge. It could simply be to work on something small like drum programming, chord creation, or arrangement. If you think about it, this is actually how most things in life work. That gym analogy was really good, so I'm gonna keep using it. If your goal is to compete in, I don't know, a powerlifting competition, then that might be the overarching goal, but you get there by working on smaller things like squats, deadlifts, and snatches. You break it down. This is another big one, and it's probably the hardest one, but it's super important. There's quite a few research out there on this, but the bottom line is that if you do all this work to set up your space, to be in the right mindset, all these things, but you can't focus, then you're not going to get very far. When you sit down to do anything, and especially with production, you have to allow yourself the time to fall fully into the task and into that flow thing that we talked about. So ideally, when you sit down to create, you want to remove as many distractions as possible. Again, each of our lives look differently, and especially if you are a parent or if you have other responsibilities. So here might be a good time and a good idea to have some conversations with the people in your life. What I would do early on in my career is I would negotiate with my now wife about chores and responsibilities. So oftentimes what I would do is I'd say like, babe, if I help with dinner and wash the dishes, can we agree that from 9 to 10 p.m. is my distraction-free production time? Something like that. Again, this is one of the hardest things to nail, but I am confident you can figure it out. I'm going to do an entire video on this because that is how strongly I feel about it, but please, for the love of God, limit your options when it comes to your tools. It's amazing that we have so many tools to choose from nowadays, but the flip side of that coin is that a ton of options can also lead to a lot of overwhelm and analysis paralysis. So pick a set of tools that you like and just stick with that. The advice that I often give my students is to stick with your DAW stock plugins until you fully master them, and only buy new stuff whenever it does something better or more efficiently than what you already have. You want to spend the majority of your time creating music, not deciding on what compressor to use. Now, with all that said, learning is still important. So what I have done over the years is that I've split my creation time from my learning time. If you already have a dedicated time to produce, then also set a dedicated time to learn if you feel you need it. But, and here's a big but, here's the most important part, make sure it's never more than the time you set aside to create. Remember to always create more than you consume. Friend, I hope this video has been helpful and inspires you to make more music this year. Now, I'm going to be taking my own advice as well, and so expect some changes here on the channel moving forward. My plan for this year is to share new types of content, specifically and especially more on the creation side, more process-driven videos, if you will. And so I hope that excites you as much as it excites me. Lastly, if you have been feeling stuck with production, then what I've done is I've created a free training where I break down my personal process for creating radio-ready music. The link is down below, so set aside some of your dedicated learning time to watch it. I promise you, it'll be worth it.